Last year, I bought and tested 18 of Amazon's most popular battery banks, and I found this hidden gem from Victomics that was 30% smaller and 30% lighter than all the other 10,000 milliamp hour battery banks for just 16 bucks. And when my sister asked me about battery banks, I was happy to have the perfect recommendation for her. But she ended up returning it because she wanted one with built-in charging cords. So to never disappoint my family again, this year I bought all 17 battery banks on Amazon that have built-in charging cords, and after 2 weeks of testing, these 4 banks from Sunpolin, Varrook, WeFancy, and Sharmast are my top recommendations. And I've got links for all those down in the description, but stick around to see all of my testing and why one might be better for you than another. And as always, there are no sponsored reviews on this channel, and I bought all these battery banks with my own money. The first thing that I did was I divided these 17 battery banks up into 2 categories based on whether or not they had an AC plug for charging directly from a wall outlet. And in this non-outlet group, the least expensive was actually one of the largest banks, and this 27,000 milliamp hour Gobelboik with built-in Lightning and USB-C cables was just $14.99, which was a bit suspicious. So to test each battery's actual capacity, I connected them to a power meter and I ran them down to 0. And to better understand the results, the first thing that you need to know is that even though battery banks are advertised in milliamp hours, that is not a unit of power. So we need to convert that into watt hours. And in my testing to level out the playing field, I'm just going to assume that all these battery banks use 3.7 volt batteries, which means that a 10,000 milliamp hour battery should have 37 watt hours of capacity. And the 27,000 milliamp hour Gobelboik should have about 100 watt hours. Unfortunately, in my testing, the Gobelboik had just 53.87 watt hours when it was discharged at 5 volts, so it should actually be advertised as more like a 15,000 milliamp hour battery, and that makes sense because it only weighed 370 grams, giving it a fairly normal power density of 0.146 watt hours per gram. Next up for 1559 is the Anker Zolo, which only has a single USB-C built-in cable that loops around instead of storing away completely. And at 5 volts, the Zolo output just 29.23 watt hours, which is only 79% of the 37 watt hours we would expect based on its 10,000 milliamp hour rating. And that, combined with its size and weight, gave it a lower power density than the Gobelboik at 0.135 watt hours per gram. After that, for $19.98 is this Varrook 10,000 milliamp hour bank with basically every possible USB cord and port, including USB-A, USB-C, USB micro, and Lightning, as well as USB-C and USB-A ports. And in my testing, the Varrook output 33.38 watt hours, which is 90.2% of its expected 37 watt hours, which is very good. But it was a bit heavier than the Anker, giving it a similar power density of 0.136 watt hours per gram. Next for $19.99 is this Sharmast 10,000 milliamp hour bank that also has every cord and port possible, but it does it without having the USB micro looped like the Varrook. The Sharmast performed almost identically to the Varrook, outputting 33.35 watt hours, which is 90.1% of its expected 37 watt hours, and it weighed a bit less for a slightly higher power density at 0.138 watt hours per gram. Then for $20.39, we've got another Varrook with a different square form factor, and this one has all the same ports and cords as before, but with the addition of quick charge and USB-C power delivery. Unfortunately, this square version only output 29.28 watt hours at 5 volts, which is just 79.1% of what we would expect from its advertised capacity. However, it was 60 grams lighter than the other Varrook, giving it a much higher power density of 0.161 watt hours per gram. After that, for $21.98 is this 10,000 milliamp hour battery from Victomics, which is the brand that stole the show in last year's video. But this Victomics looks 100% identical to the rectangular Varrook on the outside, with every cord and port type, but unfortunately it performed significantly worse, outputting just 29.83 watt hours, which is 80.6% of advertised, and it also had the lowest power density yet at 0.123 watt hours per gram. Next for $22.99 is this bank from WeFancy that has almost the exact same form factor as last year's Victomics, but it also managed to add built-in USB-C and Lightning charging cables, which had me wondering how they managed to fit all that into such a small package. But they seem to have figured it out, and the WeFancy output 29.85 watt hours when discharged at 5 volts, or 80.7% of its advertised capacity, which isn't quite as much as the Victomics from last year, but it's still enough to make it the most power-dense battery bank in both watt hours per gram and watt hours per cubic centimeter. Then for $24.79 is this 6,000 milliamp hour battery from Miso with built-in USB-C and Lightning cords, and at 6,000 milliamp hours we should expect 22.2 watt hours of capacity, but the Miso output just 7.04 watt hours, or 31.7% of its already lower advertised capacity, which means it's actually more like a 2,000 milliamp hour battery, and it had by far the lowest power density yet at 0.060 watt hours per gram, which is really bad, especially for the price. Following that up is the $24.99 Sunpulin, which has built-in USB-C and Lightning cords, a USB-C port, and in addition to supporting quick charge and power delivery, it also has MagSafe wireless charging and a recessed dimple for Apple Watch charging. And it's got an extra flip-out metal kickstand. In my testing, the Sunpulin output 32.12 watt-hours at 5 volts, which is 86.8% of advertised, and despite having all that extra tech in there for wireless charging and quick charging, the Sunpulin still had an impressive power density of 0.156 watt-hours per gram and a 30% smaller footprint than the other rectangular 10,000 milliamp hour batteries, giving it the second highest power density in watt-hours per cubic centimeter. Following up that impressive battery is something significantly less impressive, the $29.97 Uehu, which has all 4 USB cord types as well as a flashlight and a solar panel for charging, which all sounds cool, but the Uehu, which claims to be 40,000 milliamp hours, only output 50.6 watt-hours at 5 volts, which is 34.2% of its expected capacity, meaning its real capacity is somewhere around 14,000 milliamp hours. Which again totally makes sense based on its weight, and despite its low measured capacity, it still had a pretty normal power density of 0.139 watt-hours per gram. After that, for $32.99 is this 5,000 milliamp hour battery bank from Rory, which they advertise as a keychain form factor, but it's pretty big for that. In addition to USB-C and Lightning cords, the Rory has an Apple Watch charger, but it doesn't seem to support wireless phone charging or MagSafe. And in my testing, the Rory output 15.63 watt-hours at 5 volts, which is 84.5% of its expected capacity, and it had a power density of 0.117 watt-hours per gram, which is well below average. Last, the most expensive battery in this category by a significant margin is the $48.99 10,000 milliamp hour Belkin Boost Charge, which has Lightning and USB-C cables built in. The Belkin supports quick charge and power delivery, and in my testing it output 31.12 watt-hours at 5 volts, which is 84.1% of its expected capacity, but the Belkin weighed more than most, giving it a power density of just 0.130 watt-hours per gram, which is at the low end of the spectrum. And that means that so far, for the power banks without AC plugs, the 3 standouts are the WeFancy, which had the highest power density in watt-hours per gram and watt-hours per cubic centimeter, and support for USB-C power delivery, the Sunpulin, which had the second highest watt-hours per cubic centimeter, power delivery support, wireless charging, and a built-in kickstand, and the Varrouk Square, which had the second highest watt-hours per gram, power delivery support, and the most connectivity, with all 4 USB cable types and both USB port types. And next up, we've got 5 more banks with built-in AC plugs so they can charge directly from a normal wall outlet. Starting with the least expensive, the $20.87 TG90, which is a 5,000 milliamp hour battery, and it's got built-in Lightning and USB-C cables that pull down from the same side as the AC plug. The TG90 charges its own battery at 11.7 watts via its AC plug, but only supports very slow charging via pass-through, and in my testing it output less than 1 watt to my Google Pixel via the USB-C cable when it was plugged into the wall. And in my capacity testing, the TG90 output 15.73 watt-hours at 5 volts, which is 85% of its expected 18.5 watt-hours. But it did have a pretty low power density of 0.117 watt-hours per gram. Next, for $21.99 is the Vigor 10,000 milliamp hour bank, which is the first of 3 basically identical batteries. The Vigor has a Lightning cable and then a combination USB-C and USB micro cable that pull down from the side opposite the AC plug. The Vigor charges its own battery at 11.2 watts, and it supports charging via pass-through and provided 6.2 watts to my Google Pixel in addition to the 11 watts used to simultaneously charge the internal battery. During my testing, the Vigor output 33.47 watt-hours at 5 volts, which is 90.5% of its expected capacity, and it also had a decent power density of 0.149 watt-hours per gram. After that, for $23.99, is this almost identical 10,000 milliamp hour battery bank from Victomics that also has the same Lightning and combination USB-C and USB micro cables that pull down from the side opposite the AC plug. The Victomics charges its battery slightly faster than the Vigor at 11.8 watts, and it also supports charging via pass-through, providing 6.3 watts to my Google Pixel in addition to the almost 12 watts charging the internal battery. During my testing, the Victomics output 30.03 watt-hours at 5 volts, which is just 81.2% of advertised, giving it a lower than average power density of 0.131 watt-hours per gram. And then the most expensive of the identical trio is this $24.99 battery from Charmast, which also has the same Lightning and combination USB-C and USB micro cables that pull down from the side opposite the AC plug, but this Charmast seems to have slightly upgraded internals, allowing it to charge about 1 watt faster, as well as provide significantly more power via pass-through. The Charmast also had the highest percentage of its advertised capacity, outputting 33.57 watt-hours, which is 90.7% of advertised, but it weighed slightly more than the Vigor, giving it a lower power density of 0.145 watt-hours per gram. Last, the most expensive AC plug battery bank is this $24.91 10,000 milliamp hour battery from Q, which has dedicated USB-C, USB micro, and lightning cables. The Q charges its internal battery at just 6.3 watts, which is about half the speed of the other battery banks, and it only supports 4.8 watts of pass-through charging. In my testing, the Q output just 29.44 watt hours at 5 volts, which is 79.6% of advertised, and it weighed quite a bit more than the others, giving it a very below average power density of 0.108 watt hours per gram. And that means that for the AC battery banks, the clear standout was the $24.99 Charmast, which not only had the highest battery capacity, but also the highest wattage internal charger and the best pass-through charging. But the Vigor was also good, and it had a slightly higher power density in both watt hours per gram and watt hours per cubic centimeter. Next, looking at all the banks together, I measured their charging output by draining my iPhone 13 Pro and Google Pixel 7a down below 50% battery, and then I recorded the maximum charging rate for each bank, which was not all that exciting since most of these chargers only support the standard 5 volts 1.5 amps charging speed, which gave them a maximum of about 7.5 watts on both my iPhone and Google Pixel. But the Sunpulin, Anker Zolo, Varrook Square, Gobiboik, Belkin Boost Charge, and WeFancy also support both quick charge and USB-C power delivery, which lets them boost their voltage from 5 volts up to 9 volts to supply extra power. And when charging my Pixel, all of them except for the Belkin supplied over 19 watts, while the iPhone maximum charging rate was lower based on limitations that are put in place by Apple to extend your battery's health. In addition to phone charging, I also tested whether the 6 PD compatible power banks could also charge my MacBook Pro, and I was surprised to see that both the Anker Zolo and the WeFancy could not only provide power, but also charge the MacBook, with the Anker outputting 30 watts at 20 volts and the WeFancy outputting 20 watts at 12 volts. And I think that just about covers all the basic stuff, but there are a few more quirks and features that we need to talk about, all related to the charging of the banks themselves. And I measured each bank's maximum charging rate using my Anker desktop charger, and I found that the Sunpulin, Anker, and Varrook Square had the highest charging rates above 18 watts when they were using their built-in USB-C cables or their USB-C ports. But confusingly, the Varrook Square is the only bank that can charge via both its USB-C and USB-A built-in cables. And all the other battery banks that have USB-A and USB-C built-in, like the Gobiboik, Charmast, and Varrook Rectangle, can only charge with their USB-A, where they max out at 10.4 watts. And to get their maximum charging rate, you have to use your own cable with their USB-C port. Similarly, none of the AC plug battery banks can be charged by any of their built-in cables. So you either need to plug them directly into a wall outlet or plug in your own USB-C cable into their USB-C port. The wireless charger from Rory supports pass-through, and if you're plugged into its USB-C port, you can actually slowly charge your iPhone on the lightning cable and your Apple Watch on the wireless charger while still charging the bank's internal battery, while the Sunpulin suspends charging of its own internal battery whenever the wireless charger is active. But it does automatically switch back to self-charging mode once your phone or watch finishes wirelessly charging. So I know there are a lot of choices, and too long didn't watch. Here are the easy conclusions. If you want a battery bank with an AC plug, the Charmast is the best one, and it not only supports pass-through charging at the highest rate, but it also has a slightly higher capacity than the other AC plug banks. However, even though that AC plug is definitely convenient, all the other features of the Charmast are worse than my other recommendations. So if the AC plug isn't important to you, then the 4 standouts are the WeFancy, Sunpulin, Varrook Square, and the Anker Zolo. And of those, my personal favorite is definitely the Sunpulin, which gives you the option of using its MagSafe wireless charging or the built-in cables. And it's got 5, 9, and 12 volt PD charging capabilities, a very decent overall capacity at 32.12 watt hours, and the fastest recharge rate at 19.2 watts. The MagSafe is also surprisingly sturdy, and the built-in stand can hold your phone in portrait or landscape mode while wirelessly charging. And to me, the only downsides of the Sunpulin are that it only has USB-C and lightning cables, it has no USB-A port, and even though it supports 12 volt power delivery, I couldn't get it to charge my MacBook. If you're not interested in wireless charging, the Varrook Square is just as compact and energy dense as the Sunpulin, but it also includes USB micro and USB-A cords, as well as a traditional USB-A port. So if you have some older devices that need USB micro or a proprietary charging cable that needs USB-A, then the Varrook Square is probably right for you. The WeFancy is another all-around great pick with a nice slim form factor, giving it the highest power density by both volume and weight, and it has USB-A and USB-C ports, built-in Lightning and USB-C cables, and I was especially impressed by the power delivery implementation that not only had good charging speeds for my Google Pixel and iPhone 13 Pro, but it also was able to charge my MacBook using 12 volt power delivery. So if you're looking for the most power in the smallest package, then the WeFancy is right for you. And last, the Anker Zolo was pretty underwhelming in the sense that it had below average capacity, below average power density, and it only has a single built-in USB-C cable that just kind of loops around and doesn't really store away. But it was the only bank that supports 20-volt power delivery, so if that's what you need, it's kind of your only option. And the good news is that it's also pretty inexpensive. As a reminder, there are no sponsored reviews on this channel, but I do have links for all the batteries down in the description, and as always, I appreciate when you use those links, since as an Amazon affiliate, I do earn a small commission on the sale at no cost to you. I'd also like to thank all of my awesome patrons over at Patreon for their continued support of my channel, and if you're interested in supporting my unsponsored reviews, check out the links down in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, and as always, thanks for watching The Hookup.